Let me start by thanking you for inviting me to speak today. I am Paul Bordunius, and today I'm going to speak on self-organization in termites and hoplites, applying natural scientific concepts to the experimental study of the past. Well, as you might have guessed, I'm neither a historian nor an archaeologist. I am, in fact, an entomologist. I study little insects, in this case, termites. What I study is how these little insects come together in groups and do things. In this case, build enormous nests or mounds in Africa, which house upwards of 2 million termites. And what I do is I look at the way these little termites are building these huge structures, and then I derive algorithms from their behavior that we can apply to robots. So you can consider me sort of the termite whisperer who tells the robots how to act like termites. Insects are remarkable because they're very small in a world of very big things. So one of the ways they level the playing field is through organized masses or swarms. And these swarms do things like forage. You can see here, this is a swarm of ants foraging for a much larger centipede. And my termites as well will use these swarm behaviors in defense. So you can see here what looks like a little miniature phalanx of termite soldiers defending the nest from, in this case, probably a human taking this picture. But it could be an aardvark or an attack by ants. The way they achieve this organization is through a process called self-organization. It's a process where order arises from the interactions between individual parts of a disordered system. So it's the interaction of the subparts that leads to organization. The process can be spontaneous, it can be triggered by random fluctuations, and it's then amplified by a system of positive feedback. The resulting organization is completely decentralized. It's distributed over all of the components of the system. So there is no leader of this system. There's no blueprint that they're following to create this system. This is something that arises spontaneously from the individual interactions of the subunits of the system. The organization is robust and it's able to survive or to self-repair. So in my termite construction models where termites are building their mounds, if you were to break part of a mound, they will rebuild that part of the mound, and they'll organize their labor in such a way that it's appropriate to build that structure back in a form similar to the one it was before. Understanding human swarm behavior provides a context for explaining how groups of warrior move. This is important. Experimentation cannot tell us what was actually done. So I cannot put together a bunch of men in hoplite gear, no matter how accurate the panoply is, have them do something and then say that's the way the ancients did it. The scientist in me tells me the way to use this data is that it can falsify the statements of modern scholars. So other scholars that say something was impossible to do, if you can put together a bunch of reenactors in highly accurate kit and you can do that thing, well then that's evidence to falsify that statement. And if you can falsify enough statements, then hopefully this will help you narrow down the choices and provide a context for understanding how these warriors actually moved and how they fought their battles. In this self-organized system with humans, individuals react to local conditions, and the global pattern arises from this individual behavior and this individual interactions. Again, there's no one in overall charge. There doesn't have to be a leader in these masses. No one actually knows the overall state of the system. So no one actually knows what's happening anywhere but right around them. And that's what that term local means, that local conditions. And it's interesting because we have a quote from Thucydides where he tells us that each man hardly knows anything except what is occurring around himself in battle. And that's exactly what the preconditions are for this type of local interaction that leads to swarm coordination. Now the coordination can be startling. And As you can see here, this is a murmuration of starlings, which are little birds, and they are highly coordinated. This is a level of coordination that would be the envy of any cavalry officer on the plain. These birds are highly coordinated. They are able to move and avoid, in the case on the right, they're avoiding a hawk, for instance. They can avoid predators. You've probably seen fish do this as well. A number of insects do these flying swarms like this. And all of this coordination is the product of interactions between the individuals. There's no leader in this flock at all that's telling them where to go. The way in which this movement occurs and how they can be essentially so regimented and not foul each other when they fly and move in these big coordinated masses has been modeled through computer simulation to try to give us an idea of what is going on. And this outlines the current theory of what we believe is happening. Essentially, there are three components to this system. There is what's called the area of repulsion, and this is the area right around the bird or the fish or the man. And in this zone, you want to avoid fouling, or if you're a bird, you don't want your wings to clip another bird. A fish, you don't want to be interfered with. If you're a soldier, you want to have enough room to move and move your arms, move your weapons. So there's a zone right around you that you consider essentially your personal space, and you don't want another individual in that personal space. If they come in that personal space, you'll move away or push them away to create that personal space. Then, if we go to the other extreme, at the bottom you'll see there's an area of attraction, and that is the biggest circle. And this area of attraction, that is where animals do not feel safe. So if you are a bird flying in a flock, if you get too far away from other birds, you feel as though you may be subject to more predation, or you may be subject to losing track of them as you fly. So what you do is you'll move closer to the other individuals. And once you have this balance between not too close and not too far, the radius of that area is called the area of orientation. And this is the area where you will find yourself compared to all of the other birds or fish around you. And then you will just orient your movement to those individuals you see right around you. So as long as you are moving and matching your movement patterns to the individuals in this little zone of orientation, you will always move in a perfect formation because you won't get too close, you won't get too far away, and you'll match their vectors and their movement. Well, in human combatants, we see something like this actually when we do mock fighting, because there'll be an individual, like this individual here, and this individual will have a zone around him or her that will be sort of a fouling distance. They don't want to be too close with each other because too close will not allow them to move their weapons, but they also don't want to be too far away because too far away leaves them unprotected. So there's also a zone at which they'll move closer together if they're more than that space away. And finding out what this zone is one of the things that we looked at, because in looking at the literature on hoplites, there's a debate over how close together hoplites had to stand. Some say they stood somewhere between 60 and 90 centimeters of frontage, meaning that's how much room the individual had to occupy along the front line. Some say they had to have as much as 180 centimeters. So we ran experiments like this, and one of the things we found right away is that if you're using a spear, you really don't need that much frontage at all. So spearmen can be as tight as 60 centimeters, although with hoplites it's probably a little more like 72 centimeters is your minimum. And we found that the guys who we forced to stand at 180, first of all, did not like to be that far away. They felt very vulnerable. And they rather quickly lost these mock combats because, as you can see, they are essentially fighting multiple combatants. This same personal space that we see that keeps birds from fouling each other when they fly and allows them to form these masses that can move in unison, we see in terrestrial animals as well. These are ants, and these ants are actually caught in what's called a mill. I'm not going to go into why they get stuck like this, but they can get caught in these little gyres like this. And but you can see as you look at them that the spacing is actually fairly regular. They're not tripping over each other and falling over each other. So the same processes that lead to birds being able to fly in coordinated flocks can be used with running terrestrial creatures and with running terrestrial or moving terrestrial humans. We see this all the time in our own lives. We don't really think about it because we do it automatically, but drivers maintain a safe space around their cars in traffic. So if you are in traffic, you maintain a zone around your car where you know you can stop and hit the brakes before you hit the guy in front of you, or where you know that if you were to hit the brakes, the car behind you would be able to stop without hitting you. And essentially, this is the same thing that the birds are doing. We're just doing it inside this car. Well, as I said, the point of these experiments that I do is really more to falsify statements made by others than to try to, show this is how exactly it was done. Luckily, historians have made a lot of statements which can be falsified because their opinions generally are not based on personal experience and not based on experimentation. So, for instance, Adrian Goldsworthy had said that it would have been impossible for men to run and stay so closely packed together. The so closely is referring to hoplites who were packed together so that their shields overlapped in what would look like a shield wall or a battle line. So we could test this, and we did. And hoplites can indeed run at a fairly brisk pace with their shields overlapped and not foul each other. And you can see here, I just included these little GIFs because I wasn't sure if videos would play well, that these men are running, not at a sprint, but they're running pretty much as fast as you can with this equipment. And they are not, in fact, having any difficulty maintaining both the formation and maintaining space between them so that they don't trip over each other's feet. On the other side of this argument, it was said that the charge made a literal crash of lines inevitable, since rapidly advancing, heavily armed formations of hoplites would have to halt abruptly in its tracks to avoid collision. And this was by Luganville, and he is telling us that essentially once the men start charging, they cannot stop until they crash into the enemy line, because stopping is almost impossible. They would trip over themselves. And actually, a lot of authors have opined this over the years, but we can test this as well. Sometimes in experimentation, accidents tell you quite a bit. And I'm going to show you a video now of an accident that occurred while we were running one of these charge experiments. So you can see that arrow there pointing to a single hoplite. That hoplite reenactor may or may not be me. And he or me caught his toe in his other sandal lace and fell flat in his face. But what's important here is that you can see the man behind him did not fall over him, and all of the other men stopped really quickly. So stopping a running formation like this is far less daunting than one would suppose if you've never actually seen it done. Now, why they're able to stop like that is a question that we can answer because we know some of our self-organization. They're able to stop like this because the men who are running behind the front line are not taking their cue from looking in the distance. They're taking their cue from watching the backs of the men in front of them. So just like when you stop at a red light, you don't crash into the car in front of you. The fellow who was running behind me saw me fall and stopped. And he was running with enough space between us that his personal space was such that he knew he could stop before he crashed into me. Well, let's look at swarm intelligence. Swarms have an intelligence all their own, and the reason is because the same sort of interactions between individuals that we see are actually sometimes calculations. And similar to the way in which our brains make calculations based on the interactions of neurons, individual ants or termites are making little decisions when they interact with each other. The intelligent result is what we call emergent, meaning the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and it's unpredictable beforehand. It's possibly different in separate trials, so each time you run the same thing, you will not get the same result, because this result is chaotic, essentially, and it is the outcome of individual interactions. We call swarm intelligence morale. So in a group of men, swarm intelligence is the thing that governs whether you might spontaneously charge, or what we'll see in most battles, a spontaneous rout. So there are battles where hoplites, for instance, a single hoplite just decided to run at the enemy, and that precipitated a charge. And almost every battle where someone loses, the rout starts with some individual becoming afraid and leaving the ranks. To demonstrate how groups of insects, essentially as a group, think and make intelligent decisions, I'm going to describe for you a concept called quorum sensing. And the example I'm going to use has to do with honeybees. Now, honeybees, when they forage, they have a dance that they do. And the dance enables them to tell other honeybees in the hive the position and the distance to food sources. You can have situations where multiple food sources are out there, and the honeybees will essentially compete through the dance. Different dancers will be signaling different sites, and the better sites will win out the sort of dance-off between the individual bees. That is when bees are finding a new home. And when bees move from their old home to a new home, they have to find an appropriate little hole in the wood somewhere in a tree, or unfortunately sometimes in human habitation. They also use the dance to lead their other bees to this new home. And the way it works is through a process called quorum sensing. And quorum sensing is interesting because it starts with a single bee going off and finding a hole that looks suitable, and then another bee goes off and finds another hole that's potentially suitable. As they come back and dance, the vigor of their dance signals other bees as to how good that hole was that they found. And there's literally a dance-off where bees that are in the hive are watching dancers and reacting to how strongly they're dancing, and that makes it more likely to follow them to the new hole. Over time, the better site, the one they're more excited about, will attract more and more dancers. And what's interesting is that there's a threshold, essentially, that the bees will have until enough dancers are going to one site that they all fly off and go that way. We see something like quorum sensing in combat when we have individuals who are facing a decision whether to fight or to run. How does this fella here, let's say, on the bottom right, how does he decide whether to stand in combat or to run? What he's doing is he's adding up the information he's getting from all the other combatants around him. Now, some of it might be projections of steadiness, which in this case I've marked with a plus. Some of it might show men who are wavering out of fear, in this case a minus. And this individual is sensing all of that information, and that will inform the individual whether to run away or to move forward. In this case, he's surrounded mostly by pluses. That'll keep him moving forward. You can imagine a situation where he's surrounded mostly by men who are unsteady. And in that situation, he might break and rout. What's interesting about this concept is that it brings in another element that we see in social insects, and that is key individual. Because here, some individuals are so steady and project so much bravery that they can actually have a larger effect on the outcome. So for instance, you see this giant plus there in front of him. That may be enough to counter all the negatives around him and keep him fighting in combat. The obvious reverse is some men are cowardly, and if a man were cowardly and broke ranks, that could precipitate a general rout. I'm going to end today presenting some testing that we did on the assumptions of opposing paradigms of hoplite combat. And this centers around something called the othismos in hoplite combat, or the mass pushing. And there are two big groups of trains of thought on hoplite combat. One was dubbed the orthodoxy, and there's a lot to it, but they are the champions of the idea that hoplites actually physically pushed the other formation off the field. So in battle, the opposing phalanxes charged while separated by hundreds of meters, and they crashed directly into each other. They would get one good thrust with their spear before slamming their big shields into their foes, using momentum from the charge to add force and to aid this mass pushing that involved all the ranks of men together, and they pushed until one side gave way. Opposite them was a group dubbed the heretics, and when battle came to close quarters in their view, men didn't pack together. They fought with wide gaps between them of the type I showed you earlier, and this allowed for complex weapon play and such. Battle was decided through spear and sword, and any notion of pushing was figurative, or at best sort of shield bashing between individuals or pairs of hoplites. Because of my background, when I was looking at this, I realized that the group that believed in pushing had the mechanics of pushing all wrong. And the group that believed there was no pushing didn't understand how pushing occurs in things like crowd disasters. So my view is based on pushing in combat really as something that occurs like any crowded environment. And just for an example here to see what I'm talking about, this was the disaster in Dusseldorf back in 2010 at the Love Parade. There were 21 people crushed to death, 8 men, 13 women, and 640 people were injured in just a crowding incident where people were squished together. What happens when you're pressed together like this is you cannot breathe. It's called compressional asphyxia. Your bodies are crushed together to the point where you can't extend your diaphragm. If you can't extend your diaphragm, you can't take in a breath of air, and you'll die. I figured out that hoplites had something, though, that really most other types of combatants didn't have, and that was a very specific type of shield. And if you look at the shield itself on the right-hand panel there, you see that it has a profile that arches over the body, and it protects that part of the body which gets crushed during asphyxia. And the way this works is this is a profile of the aspis here. The depth of the shield is such that it rests on the upper chest and the front of the left shoulder on the top, and on the bottom it rests on the left thigh. And what this means is that you can't crush the collarbone, upper chest, shoulder, or thigh all that easily. So as long as that shield doesn't give way, you can remain breathing because it arches over the soft parts of the body. And I was able to show this just by holding it in a different position than you would when you were, let's say, spear fencing in a phalanx. So that's the spear fencing while in a phalanx position versus the shield position in optismos. You can withstand this sort of a crushing environment. Of course, not everybody believed this. So Chris Matthew came out and said that contrary to Bardunius' conclusions, the bulk of the aspis, or the shield, would make it impossible for the members of a phalanx to crowd each other like this. Both the shield and the individuals would be unlikely to withstand such pressures. So, being an experimental biologist, we tested it. In 2015, at the Archeon Dromena reenactment event at the Marathon Battlefield in Greece, we were able to get a number of hoplite reenactors together. And what we did is we fixed a force sensor to this tree, and then we just pushed against that force meter with lines of men. And by adding a new man over time, we could get a curve for how much force each new man added to the aggregate push. And then we can also get the pushing force of all of them together. So the maximum force we were able to generate was with lines of about 7 men. We actually generated 368 kilopons. That's 811 pounds or 3,609 newtons of force felt by that tree as we pushed against it. Perhaps more important than the total force that we were able to output through these files of men pushing was the average force over time that was being put out by these files. So if we look at the files of men pushing and we look at the amount of force on average, which includes the peaks and the lulls, for about a minute between each, the addition of each new man. That's what this graph is showing. This is the force, the average force between each new man. And what you'll see is that as you add more men in line, the force increases, but the amount of force being added goes down for each man. Eventually, this would plateau, and there'd be a point at which adding more men to the line really doesn't add that much more in the way of pushing, just because it's very difficult to coordinate once the line gets very long. Underneath, you can see a second line, and the top line is the force that was put out by the men who were pushing like a crowd, leaning against each other. And the bottom line is men who had not been trained to push like a crowd, but were trying to push as the old orthodoxy had suggested. And you can see the crowd style of pushing puts out a lot more force and a lot more average force. In 2019, at the Western Martial Arts Workshop in Racine, Wisconsin, I was lucky enough to have access to a large group of combatants with shields that were not hoplite shields, but they were close. They were rotella, and they were concave enough to keep us alive and keep us breathing. But they were not quite as big as the aspis shields of the Greeks, so they didn't work quite as well. But even amongst this group, we were able to generate a force of 306 kilopounds. That's 675 pounds, or 2,999 newtons. And you can get a feel for just what this was like. You're squished together here, and you can see that there's a give and take that happens between these two crowds. But at no time really is anybody in danger of falling over, because there's no space to fall over in. I can tell you that this was as daunting mentally as it was physically. We had a number of individuals who actually had to come out of the experiment just because the claustrophobia and the being caught up in this press was just really too much. Well, in the future, we're going to continue this line of investigation. We'd like to get larger groups of hoplites in the field and get some more targeted apparatus out there to do some more focused experimentation on different things like strength of strikes, and get some drones overhead to give us some more accurate footage of spacing. But I would like to thank you guys for having me talk today, and also I'd like to thank the members of the Archeon Dromena reenactment group in 2015 and the 2019 Western Martial Arts Workshop.